Okay, so now that we have talked about some of the basics of evolution and natural selection, and just a little bit about the logic behind it and how populations change over time, I want to take a moment to talk about the overall evidence for evolution. There are some major lines of evidence. So there's a diversity of evidence that supports our knowledge that evolution is a thing and it is happening. And I just think it's appropriate to introduce some of those lines of evidence early because you guys all have different backgrounds regarding evolution. Some of you might have some misconceptions about evolution. And if you're going to talk about something as large and all encompassing in biology as evolution, you really, really, really need to get those preconceptions out early so that we can kind of introduce um, ways to address those. And so there's a lot of different pieces of evidence that support our theory of evolution, including some mathematical evidence. And I introduced that just a little bit in the last lecture with Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, but we're going to really get into that when we get to that chapter. And so, just some of the evidence that we are going to see for evolution fall into four major categories. We have the geographical evidence, so that of course refers to where in the world you're talking about. We have physical evidence, so most commonly you're going to see that in the form of fossils, but there are other examples as well that we will address. There is chemical evidence or biochemical evidence, depending on who you ask. Okay, and so that's going to be primarily DNA and its universality. So just how common DNA is in every living thing. That is, it is, inside of every living thing. And then we have mathematical evidence. So this is a little bit about that, like Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium idea that we talked about, as well as some calculations that we're going to be doing. So we talked about geographical evidence just a moment ago, and that was one of the major types. So now we're going to start talking about this term biogeography. So it's geography, so where in the world you are, and with life or bio in front of it. And so biogeography is basically showing us where species are and how they got there. And so biogeographical evidence in the context of evolution is all about how species have changed and diverged in the past and their location, what their location can tell us about their evolution. And so we can see that there are more closely related species in the same region. And we can see this in conjunction with fossil evidence as well. But let's just start small. So typically, if you are nearby another thing, like another living thing, you're going to be more likely to look similar to them if we're talking about evolution. Okay, so like you can think of Darwin's finches, all those islands in the Galapagos were very, very close together, and those were all very similar species because they all came from one original species. So Darwin noticed this. He noticed that there were lots of different species on the island and not just of the finches. He noticed this about a lot of things like tortoises, for instance, right? And so that's the kind of thing that kind of gets glossed over. We usually just focus on the finches because it's a very charismatic organism. It's one that people can picture and it's very, very visually interesting. But Darwin also noticed this about the shells of the Galapagos tortoises. So he noticed that different structures were present in the shells depending on where you were on the islands. And so he did a lot of detailed drawings of these different shells, and I don't want to bog down on it because you don't need to memorize that or even know any of the species names for these different Galapagos tortoises. But he just noticed, hey, there are different shells on different islands, but there are still a lot of similarities amongst all of these tortoises across the islands. Okay. So now we need to start talking about fossils. So fossils are preserved remains or impressions. So fossils do not have to contain any structure from the original organism. It could just be the impression left by a structure. So like a footprint, for instance, left by an organism would still be considered a fossil even if there is no part of the foot present. Okay? It's just proof that there was this thing here. Okay? And so this will allow us to kind of get an insight into the past of an area, the biological past of an area, as well as the geological past. And so we can track how different structures in species have changed over time by looking at the fossils. Now, fossils are very, very rare to form, like, it is extremely unlikely that if you look at a bird right now, like the first bird you see outside, that there's going to be a fossil of that bird in 4 million years. It's most likely going to get broken down. The conditions have to be just right in order for fossils to form. And we're going to talk a little bit about what those conditions are, but really that's beyond the scope of this class. It's mostly just you need to realize that fossils are rare, and so we work with what we can get. Okay, so here we have the evolution of the modern horse from its biological ancestors. All right, and so we can see as we look back, so up top we have our modern horse, and then down here we have more ancestral horses. Okay, we can see that overall the hooves changed a bunch, as well as the size of the organism. So the organism itself was quite small to begin with, and then over evolutionary time, that lineage got larger and larger. But also the hooves were were individual digits before. So it wasn't just one single hoof like it is now. Right now, it's literally almost like one giant finger with a giant fingernail, okay? Because all of those digits are kind of molded together. But before, it was almost more like, it looks more like a high heel or a bird kind of situation down here. We have different digits coming off of that one limb. Okay, and so over evolutionary time, those got smaller and smaller, and that big one right there got more and more pronounced until it became pretty much the only one. Okay. And so we will find these fossils, and then we need to be able to place when they were formed, because you can find as much evidence as you want, but if you don't know where it is in the timeline, then it's kind of hard to compare it to ancestors before and after it. And so basically, there are a lot of ways that we can tell how old a fossil is, like depending on where in the ground it was found. We can do like carbon dating and all that. But ultimately, that's all beyond the scope of this class. Just know that we have really, really well established ways of establishing how old rocks and fossils are. And so when we find fossils, whether they be entire skulls, for instance, or just remnants of skulls, we can basically place the evolution of that lineage. We can place that piece of the puzzle where it belongs. And so here we see just a little bit on the evolutionary history of Homo sapiens. So that is, of course, humans from its ancestors. Okay, I do not need you to memorize this or anything. Just realize that it's little changes over evolutionary time. So, like, there's little differences between chimpanzees and gorillas that, if we were to look into their evolutionary past, would have been slowly formed, and we could eventually find a common ancestor between chimpanzees and gorillas. And we can do the same thing with humans. Okay. And so one of the ways by which we figure out how old a fossil is called relative dating. Okay. So this is not when you go out on a date with someone in your family. Relative dating is basically you look at the fossil and you look at the rocks around the fossil, and you try to figure out how old those rocks are, and then that allows you, when comparing to other fossils, basically put it into the appropriate period of geologic history. And it's called relative because we're comparing it to the other rocks nearby as well as other fossils from those periods so that we can figure out exactly where it came from. So there's also absolute dating, and this is like a way more precise way of doing this, but basically this allows us to figure out exactly how old a fossil is. And so we do this typically through radiometric dating, and I don't need you to memorize anything about radiometric dating. Just know that we have ways by which we figure out how old rocks and fossils are that are very, very precise. Basically, we look at different isotopes. Okay, so remember, isotopes are molecules that have different numbers of neutrons than what you typically might think of. So, like potassium normally has this many neutrons, but in a radioactive isotope, so that's an unstable version of it, maybe it has more neutrons. And so we can track that, and they have a different half-life. Basically, when a sample will completely change because it is radioactive, and you don't need to worry about any of that, but there are different isotopes that we can track, and so we can basically just figure out, based on how much of the sample is gone, how old the sample is. Okay? And your book will talk a little bit about an isotope's half-life, which is basically how long it takes for half of the sample to degrade. You don't need to be able to do very many calculations with this. We might do one or two just as practice, but it's really beyond the scope of AP biology. But one thing that you will see a lot of is carbon-14. So this is a common isotope for carbon that we use. So this is what is referred to as carbon dating. You've probably heard that term before. And basically, over time, while organisms are alive, organisms will accumulate this just naturally. So, like taking in organic molecules as an animal, because organic molecules come from organisms like trees. As you eat these plants, those plants had basically taken in their own carbon-14, and now that you're eating them, you're going to accumulate some carbon-14. And so we can basically figure out by how much carbon-14 is left in the tissue how old that organism is. So that's really, really useful, but it's mainly useful because as we start to figure out how old things are and how closely related they are to other things, we can start to create a phylogenetic tree. So phylogenetic trees are ways that we show evolutionary relationships. So it's basically a visual representation of evolution. And we're going to practice so much with creating trees and analyzing trees because that is so heavily tested, at least in the history of the AP Bio exam. It is so heavily tested. You have an entire chapter on phylogeny, so it's super, super important. And you're not yet at the level where you can create a phylogenetic tree, let alone with isotopic data. Like, I don't ever expect you to be able to do that. But based on timelines that are provided to you, you should eventually be able to create a phylogeny. But also, we can do it based on structures, and usually it's best if you can use both structures and timelines to create a phylogenetic tree that is most supported. And so we also do mathematical calculations to analyze fossils. So, like, that's how we figure out how old they are, what makes them up, and that allows us to track when they were formed, from whom they were formed, and basically we can figure out a little bit on the overall lineage. So that kind of takes me to the end of okay, we found fossils, and this is how we figure out how old they are. So now that we have fossils, we can look at morphological homologies, is what they're called, or homologous structures. So you remember that term homologous from homologous chromosomes, and those are the same term for a reason, and we'll get there. But basically, morphological homologies are structural features that are shared because organisms have common ancestry. So on the left here, I have a pterodactyl. Okay, and so those limbs, or excuse me, that limb, those bones have been confirmed by fossil evidence. And then there are bird limbs there's a bird limb on the bottom picture. And there are a lot of similarities as you look more and more into the different limbs and the bones that make them up. But we don't just see this in limbs, we see this inside of our own bodies when we look at our organs. So homologous structures are basically anything that is common between two living things because they shared a common ancestor that had that thing. So even we as humans have a lot in common with insects, for example. And so you can see that insects have things like small intestines, right? Just like we do. And that's because we share a common ancestor with insects that also had a small intestine. Now, that doesn't mean that insects have the exact same small intestine. There are differences. It's shorter, right? It's obviously significantly smaller. But the reason we both have that and they're made up of some of the same tissue types is because we have a common ancestor in common. All right. So this is a classic diagram that you're going to see. And this is basically the pentadactyl limb or five-fingered limb. This is the quintessential homology example. So homology is just a homologous structure, basically. Okay. And so we see the same structures in the same relative location across a ton of different taxa, a ton of different groups of organisms. So on the left here, I have a human. You'll notice that there are some familiar bones. So up top, we have the humerus, right? That's that brown color. Okay. We have the radius right here in this lightish pink, and we have the ulna in the red. So let's just focus on those for now. So those three structures can be found in dogs, birds, whales, and everything in between. So basically any vertebrate that you can think of that has a limb has these same structures. Now that doesn't mean they're all the same. Like the humerus up top is modified in all of these organisms. For instance, in the whale, it's very short and stubby, right? Whereas in the human, it's much more elongated. However, they are made up of the same types of cells or the same type of tissues, or they are basically from the same embryological development. And so all that is going to make sense in a bit. But we see a lot of similarities, even though they're all modified across each other. We see very similar structures or the same structures across different organisms. Just and what is the likelihood that the dog independently evolved the ulna to look almost identical to our ulna? It's very unlikely, right? It probably came from common ancestry. So this is just one thing that is a really, really big piece of evidence that you need to be familiar with, is that common ancestry leads to structures that are very similar. So this is a homologous structure, this pentadactyl limb. However, we also have this other term called analogous structures. And so this is kind of the exact opposite. So if homologous structures are structures that are the same or similar because of common ancestry, analogous structures are structures that are similar, that maybe they do the same thing, but not because of common ancestry. So the classic example you're going to see is a wing. Okay, so like wings have evolved multiple times. Bats have wings, birds have wings, insects have wings, right? But they did not all get wings from the same ancestor, because if they did, we would see wings in almost every other organism along that evolutionary chain. Okay. And so we instead refer to these as analogous structures because they have a lot of similarities, right? So like in the case of a wing, they always allow you to fly. Well, not always, I shouldn't say that, but they allow flight. But structurally, there are a lot of differences. So like bats don't have feathers, right? Whereas birds do, and insects don't have feathers, but the structure is overall the same. It's kind of an elongated, very thin thing that comes off of a limb usually. And so there are a lot of similarities in structure and often in function. But when we look at the individual tissues, they're entirely different. Okay, so like there's no feather tissue on a bat wing, right? So, while we're on the topic of structures and how those structures have come to evolve and change over time, this is a term that you've definitely heard of before, but vestigial structures are things that you can find in living organisms, but they don't serve their function anymore. Okay. And so this is just another piece of evidence that supports evolution, because if every organism was just designed, why give them something that serves no function? Instead, it's a thing that resembles a structure in another more closely related organism that still uses that structure. Okay. And so snakes, for instance, you can see that they have a reduced hind leg structure. Okay. You can see that they have the remnants of a leg. So, like at some point in their development, their bodies were told, okay, stop making a leg. Okay. But there's still evidence that at one point in their evolutionary history, their ancestors had more of a leg than what we see now. Okay. And so we see a lot of this, especially in our daily life. So, tailbones, for instance, were once connected to a tail. Obviously, humans no longer have a tail, right? But we still have the tailbone. So what's the purpose of that? Well, there is no purpose anymore because we don't have the tail anymore, right? And so that's why it's a vestigial structure. We don't use it anymore. So wisdom teeth are another example. We know that wisdom teeth kind of get in our way, right? And that's why we sometimes have to get them removed. Once they were really, really important for eating rough foods, but as humans have changed over time, and as humans have been able to develop their own food systems over time, we no longer need to resort to eating some of those foods. And so the wisdom teeth are no longer necessary, and thus they're just kind of a fossil of our past, right? They're just kind of there, and we don't use them, and often they're even a hindrance. They're a bad thing. Luckily, we can deal with that, but some things are much harder to deal with as vestigial structures. And then here's the classic thing that you think of when you hear of vestigial structures, the appendix. Now, the appendix isn't as useless as some people think. Now, obviously, your appendix can get to be inflamed and then possibly burst, and so some people do have to have their appendix removed. So the appendix can cause some problems, much like the wisdom teeth. However, some relatively recent research has suggested that the appendix actually houses some good bacteria. Obviously, you need some bacteria in your gut, right? Not all bacteria is bad. Most bacteria is either good or neutral. And you need some of it in your gut in order to be able to digest food properly. And sometimes, if you have a really severe sickness, or if you have something that disrupts your gut flora, so like the stuff that lives inside of your gut, you might lose a lot of that good bacteria. So maybe you have diarrhea for an extended period of time. Well, when you have diarrhea for an extended period of time, you're losing a lot of bacteria through your poop. Like your poop, a significant amount of your poop already is bacteria. It's just the bodies of bacteria that are just kind of along for the ride. They went through your gut and now they're gone. And they usually get replaced by the good bacteria that you still have in your system. But if too much of it goes away, you might need to recolonize your intestines, right? You might need to like bring in some reinforcements. And so the appendix is actually thought to house some good bacteria so that if you do need to recolonize your gut at all, uh, those bacteria can kind of come in and do that for you. So it's an interesting little aside that maybe the appendix served one purpose before and has now been co-opted to serve a new purpose, but it's all relatively recent, so it's hard to say with absolute certainty at this point. But that takes us into biochemical evidence. So we were talking about morphological evidence all this time. So here on the left, I have all the key terms for the morphological evidence. Now we're moving into the biochemical line of evidence. So these are basically your genetic similarities. So first of all, every living thing has the same DNA, or I shouldn't say the same DNA, the same genetic code, right? The same DNA leads to the same proteins if it's in the same sequence, right? We all have the same 4 DNA bases, okay? And they all code for the same amino acids when you go through the sequencing. So, by observing these similarities across these sequences, we can actually see how closely related organisms are. And so, more closely related organisms are going to have more DNA in common. So, like humans and chimpanzees have much more in common, genetically speaking, than humans and a pill bug, right? There's still a lot in common because we're not that far away from a pill bug evolutionarily speaking, right? But we have less in common with them than we do with a chimpanzee, who we are much more closely related to. And so we can basically do this with any organism. We can sequence their DNA, see how much we have in common with them, and thus we can create a mathematical model for how closely related we are to other organisms. And this is a very complicated process, and it's actively being worked on by scientists all over the world. And we can track different populations of humans and other organisms. And so I don't at all expect you to be able to do that yourself. Just know that it is happening and it is improving every single day. And so this is a line of mathematical evidence. So it's kind of the line between biochemical and mathematical evidence kind of gets blurred in this case, right? But we can track allele frequencies. So that takes us to our Hardy-Weinberg stuff that we still haven't like really delved into. We can track allele frequencies within a population as well. And as we track those allele frequencies, we can see whether a population is truly changing over time, is truly evolving. So that kind of wraps up our primer on the evidence of evolution. And so I have some videos here that I would highly recommend that you take a look at. Specifically, the Stated Clearly What is Evidence for Evolution is an excellent resource. I love this crash course video for Evolution, It's a Thing. And then finally, homologous versus analogous structures. Just in case you're really struggling with that, I highly recommend that you watch this video to kind of break down those differences. And so that is the end of our primer of the evidence of evolution. And now we can actually start to apply the ideas of natural selection and see how populations actually change over time.